This is English shorthand dictation number 90 and the dictation speed is 120 words per minute. Ready? Start. The House is aware that when this resolution was passed, we were required to submit an interim report on fundamental rights within 6 weeks, an interim report on minorities' rights within 10 weeks, and our final report within 3 months from the date of our appointment. We have tried our best to adhere to this timetable, but regret that it has not been possible for us to carry it out. At our first meeting held last month, we decided unanimously to request you to extend the time limit for the submission of the reports in anticipation of the sanction of the Assembly. We are fully conscious of the necessity of completing our work with the utmost dispatch, but we fear it is not possible to work to a rigid timetable. We request, therefore, that the Assembly may be moved to extend the time limit to such date or dates as you may choose in your discretion. Sir, this is a preliminary report or an interim report, because when the committee sat down to consider the question of fixing the fundamental rights and its incorporation in the Constitution, it came to the conclusion, firstly, that the fundamental rights should be divided into parts. The first part justiciable and the other part non-justiciable. Even while considering the first part, it came to the conclusion that we could not come to a final decision as to what fundamental rights are to be incorporated in the Constitution. Considering all the circumstances that exist today, points may arise for suggesting additional fundamental rights and also for making minor alterations or suggestions that may be considered advisable. This report is a draft report. I may also suggest for the consideration of the House that in considering the various clauses that have been recommended by the advisory committee, the House may not strictly consider the wording of each clause of the rights suggested. Certain changes may be required while legally drafting the clauses, and it would be better to leave the drafting to the drafting committee, which will make such changes as may be necessary to put them in proper phraseology. What I would submit to the House to do today is generally to accept the principles of each of the clauses that have been suggested for consideration, so that we may not have to devote more time in considering the technical legal details of the phraseology to be adopted. We have now suggested for the consideration of the House those rights that are justiciable. We have not been able to consider the second chapter. The Fundamental Rights Subcommittee met and considered this matter for a fortnight and devoted considerable labor and time. After that, the report was passed on to the Minorities' Rights Subcommittee. That committee also sat over this report and anxiously considered various clauses and made certain changes, and those changes were adopted. They sat for 3 days, and then this report was again placed before the advisory committee for its consideration. The advisory committee sat for 2 days, and at their 2 sittings they considered the whole thing over again. The House will see that this is not a haphazard report. It has been considered in all its various aspects. It is quite possible to make suggestions, alterations, and additions, and move amendments, but the House may not have that time which the committees had. I would humbly submit to the House to scrutinize the various clauses that have been suggested, and when amendments are put forward before the House, they will also be carefully scrutinized. There are about 150 amendments, and scrutiny of the amendments will take some time. The office has been able to scrutinize about 25 or 30 amendments, and that will perhaps take the whole of today's meeting. I move that the report be taken into consideration, and if that motion is adopted, then we can go and consider the rights clause by clause. This is the stage at which general observations can be made according to the rules followed by the legislatures, and I hope I am strictly in order in dealing with the report generally. It is not necessary for me to say whether I agree to the main provisions of the report or whether I want it to be rejected as a whole. All that I can be fairly called upon to do at this stage is to state my point of view and to ask the House to be careful in dealing with some important matters which are included in this report. Sir, to illustrate my first point, I refer to clause 10 of the report, which deals with what may roughly be called freedom of interstate commerce. It may be a very desirable thing in itself, and probably everyone here will want that trade between the different units of the Indian Union should be absolutely free. But I doubt whether a clause like this can be included among fundamental rights. Clause 10 deals with a matter which impinges directly on the rights of the provinces. You may deal with it when you come to settle the powers of the Union and the provinces. But I submit that you cannot take so important a matter outside the purview of the committee that will consider the Union and the provincial constitutions by calling the freedom of interstate commerce a fundamental right. Again, it is stated in one of the provisos to this clause that nothing in this section shall prevent any unit from imposing on goods imported from other units the same duties and taxes to which the goods produced in the unit are subjected by them. Sir, there are other examples of this kind that I could give, but I do not think that I need to do so in order to illustrate what I have in mind. Now, I will give an illustration or two to show where matters which can hardly be called justiciable have been included in the report. Clause 8 deals with certain familiar fundamental rights: the freedom of speech, the right to assemble peacefully and without arms, and the right to form associations. But they have all been made subject to certain safeguards which have been considered necessary in every country. But it is well known that these safeguards practically make the rights that I have just mentioned non-justiciable. You may confer general rights on the citizens of India, but if they are to be surrounded with the restrictions mentioned here, then the right will in practice cease to be justiciable. They will be no more than directive principles of a policy, and there seems to be no advantage in considering such matters at this stage when we should be considering only those rights that are, strictly speaking, enforceable by the courts. I shall give another instance in order to make my point of view still clear. I refer to clause 8, subclause E, which deals with the right of every citizen to reside and settle in any part of the Union, to acquire property, and to follow any occupation, trade, business, or profession. This is subject to the condition that provision may be made by law to impose such reasonable restrictions as may be necessary in the public interest, including the protection of minority groups and tribes.